Good morning, and welcome back to Jack's Coffee Break. My name is Jackal, this is my coffee break. We are continuing our build tutorial series today. Thus far in the series, we have talked about the widget tool, which is this little tool. If I bring it up, we've got our construction pieces. We go into one of the non-gridded items. This is your widget tool. Our first tutorial was how to use this, as well as all of the different settings that you have over here, just covering the basics of building, so that way you can get comfortable with that. I found that if you're not comfortable with the tools that you're using, then often it becomes more frustrating than not to try and build anything. So if you would like a refresher, I recommend doing that. After that, we built this little building right here. We took your standard square 4x4 box with absolutely nothing on it and turned it into this little shack right here. This is our trade center. So if you would like a little bit of practice on using those build tutorial, or if you would like a little bit of practice using those build skills and just practicing your abilities a little bit, I recommend that tutorial, just following along with it or trying your hand at some of the things we talk about. Afterwards, we moved on to a larger project and we built this multi-purpose building. So in this case, by multi-purpose, I mean that we have an area in the front here for your guests. So we have a food stand, a drink stand, and a bathroom. Attached to that in the back here, we have our staff facility. So we have a keeper hut and a staff rest area. And we talked about how to make those two items work in conjunction without having it negatively impact your guests, as well as incorporating a habitat into your building and how you can use the habitat to increase the value of the building as well. So if that's something that you're interested in learning, I recommend checking out that tutorial. However, today we are going to be talking about multi-level buildings. So this is a building that is 2 stories or higher, and how you make that work. Because there's several tricks that we need to do, and most of them regard pathing. So pathing is going to be its own dedicated tutorial, but consider this a pathing part 1 as much as it is a build tutorial as well. So first off, let's go ahead and start by getting out our facilities. I think that we want this to be a guest facility. So let's go ahead and make sure that we have all of our guest items. I think for this one, I would like to have one of each. So let's get out an information center. Next, let's get out a food stall. Sorry, that was a drink stall. A food stall. Let's find a merchandise. I think that I would like to do Hats Fantastic. Let's get out a toilet. Let's see here. Information, food, drink, merchandise, toilet. So that should be everything. And I think for this particular one, I would like to have 2 merchandise. Let's see here. How do we want to do this? So we've got these. Let's back up a little bit. So I think for this building, I would like to do one of each. We're going to have a drink stand, a food stand, an information kiosk, a merchandising stand, and a toilet. So we know that the toilet has to be a block. So let's go ahead and get that out. And then after that, we have some determinations that we need to make. So we know that this is going to be a multi-level building, simply for the sake of showing you guys how this works. What do we want on the first level, and what do we want on the second level? So I think one of the things to remember is going to be that whenever you have a stand like this, there is a queue that needs to form outside of the stand. So for example, if we get out this drink stall, let's get out just a simple cosmic cow. When we go to do our pathing, we need to remember that there needs to be this 4 meters in front of the stall. This is where our guests are going to queue. Anything longer than that, and that's when we hit something called a bulk point. And that's where the guests decide that they would rather search for another line to join. This is what helps to manage your guest average needs. However, for this zoo, I don't have any guest access at this point. I have this one little stand right here, and the guests can't even spawn in through it. So I'm not particularly concerned about that, as far as like meeting our demands for this thing. That's basic game. But I do need to remember that we need to have 4 meters in front of this on both levels. So how are we going to achieve that? Well, first, I think that for the bottom level, I would rather do stands, and for the second level, I would rather do boxes. And this is purely for an illustrative and artistic choice. Obviously, you can do this however you like. I just want to show that you can mix and match these different objects. So let's say that for the bottom, because these are going to be high use, let's go ahead and get out a couple of stands. Let's go ahead and get our Pipshot water, because that one always does well. Water always sells very well on just about any map. And for our food, let's get out a Monsieur Frites. So that's 1, 2, 3 out of our 5 guest objects. For the second level, we're going to go ahead and get our information kiosk. We're going to make sure that we are at 4 meters. When we bring in a kiosk stand, it's going to automatically subdivide our grid into 2 meter by 4 meter increments, so we need to keep that in mind. And I'm going to move it up. Because my grid is set at 4, it's going to immediately move it 4 meters up in the air. And I'm going to set it back 1. And I will show you why in a little bit. Next, I will stack my merchandise up here as well. I'm going to get a Hat's Fantastic. So we now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 objects. This is going to be an uneven building, but that's going to be okay. So the next thing that we need to do is we need to get an actual structure around this. So I'm going to go ahead and go into construction. We have previously been using the Arctic wood for all of these examples, but for this one I think I want to mix it up a little bit. This time I think that I'm going to use a mixed combination of materials. So for the bottom floor, I'm going to use dry stone. I'm going to go ahead and set these here, I believe. And I'm going to frame this set of objects out. So I'm going to encase my bathroom. I'm going to make sure that the walls match up on the back. But I'm not going to match everything up on the front. I'm going to leave it like this. And then I'm going to finish managing my bathroom. So for example, we know that the top of this building is going to be empty. There we go. So we're going to have something roughly this shape. Now, I have extended the stone all the way up here for illustrative purposes, but because I want this to be a mixed medium building, I think that I'd rather replace these with plaster, and I'll show you why in a little while. There we go. And let's go ahead and get our shop front sorted out. There we go. Now, I don't think that I like this slightly pinky orangey color that the plaster normally comes in. I think that I would rather have this be some kind of white. There we go. So now we need to think about how our pathing is going to work. This is where things get a little bit finicky. So now that we have our group organized, we can go into paths. We can select align to grid, and we can decide that for this pathing, let's do, Lodgewood, this one right here. I'm going to go ahead and select my group 348. And I'm going to start blocking in all of my different objects. Here we go. Now we do run into a problem right here. See, I've recessed it, but I can't actually add anything to these objects. So this is a problem when we start layering paths on top of each other. They don't necessarily like to be within 4 meters of each other. Ideally, we actually need this to be just a little bit higher. However, that causes some problems with our gridding. So let's see what we have available to us. We have flattened terrain turned off, we have tunneling turned off. Occasionally toggling flattened terrain and tunneling on things that have no business having those can help, but in this case it's not. So what is the next thing we can do? Let's try getting rid of these bottom floors. Can we add them back in? Partially. So this is another option that we have available, is doing the bottom floors second after we do our top floors. And this is sort of the problem with trying to get pathing to work in this game. No matter what, you're going to spend a lot of time arguing. So is there another way that we can do this? Yes. Rather than have this top floor face outward with the bottom floor, let's select all of the items on the top floor and rotate them around, so that the building is layered like this. Now when we go to add our pathing, align to grid, get from group, there we go. And we no longer have pathing issues. So now we need to figure out how to get people from this top floor down to the ground. So there are some important things that we need to remember. When we go to do pathing, and we want to change levels, our pathing will only decrease, will only go down or up in 1 meter increments or 2 meter increments. So if I deselect my grid, I have angle snap turned on, and I have curb slopes turned off. For now, I want this off. When I drag, this is going to give me a 1 meter slope. This will give me a 2 meter slope. This is the steepest it can go. So we know that we have to have a space of 8 meters available for this singular 4-meter area to get down to the ground. So there are a number of ways that we can do this. If we align back to the grid, let's get off of this grid. Let's go here. We can instead go down 4 meters, create a little landing, turn left, go down another 4 meters, and create this L-band box, as opposed to going this direction. This can be useful. Let's say that we want this to be a square. We simply align to grid, click that out, and make sure that we have square edges attached, and now we have this square here. So there are multiple ways that we can do this. Let's test them out on the building. We know that we need this to be at least 8 meters long because this 4 meters is going to be a queue. This 4 meters is going to be the area where the guests can actually pass through. We can either go around this edge, or we can come around this edge. I think that I'll come around this edge. So I've clicked one selection out. I'm going to deselect my grid. If I come down like this, then I've created an extra space where I need to come out this way. This elongates my building, and it doesn't necessarily make it look good. So rather than doing that, I'm going to go back to aligning to my grid, and we end up with this clipping issue through here. Now if I deselect my grid, and I try to make it go down, I'm going to get this awkward angling. I'm going to align back to my grid, and I'm going to remove this path. Now I can deselect my grid, and I can make our stairway. There we go, and now we have a simple wraparound staircase that our guests can use. At this point, let's go back and replace this stairway. Now we also have to remember that for this selection right here, we're still going to need to have 4 meters for the guest to queue. On one hand, we can push these little stalls backwards into this hole a little bit, or we can increase the area of pathing, so that way it sits more like this. Either way works. It just depends on how you want to do the aesthetics of your building. So this is option A, and this is option B. I want this building to have a small footprint, so I think that I'm going to use this selection. With that being the case, let's go ahead and frame out these boxes. We know that we have this pathing right here, which is going to dip down into our visible area. So how are we going to fix this? Are we going to fix this? We also see that we have staff floating in the air. Let's go ahead and unpause real quick so that way they can float away. There we go. Let's get out our dry stone and let's do our infill. With the dry stone, we have 2 choices of wall. We can either use the standard wall, or we can use the wall with the curved base. Layered together, they would give us an effect like this. An option that we have available because we're using this build tool is we can have it create these sort of slopes. However, while this adds a little bit aesthetically to the inside, it does create the possibility that our guests, when they're bouncing around in here, are going to clip through the wall. And I don't want that. So we're just going to use the standard. Because of the properties of this material, we see that we are already getting these unique texture points. I like these, and I think that I want to keep them. Let's go ahead and finish adding some structure to this area. For this, I think that I want to use the arches, if I have them available in this toolkit. I have these arches. I think I'll use these. There we go. So now we need to add support to our paths. One of the easiest ways to do this is to just simply bring this wall, duplicate it out because we're using this back area, bring it forward, and let's expand our footprint here. At this point, we can decide whether or not we want to have an arch here and have it go flat across. This could potentially look good. Or if we would like to use our slopes, and because we have it at the steep angle, we need our 2 meters, and leave this open. I think that I would rather have flat walls for this. So that's what I'm going to do, but if you would like to do something else while you practice this, you're more than welcome to use the alternative method. Let's go ahead and finish up our back wall through here, and we have our floor plan done. So now this area through here is going to remain exposed to the elements. There is a bit of a question of whether or not we would want that. Personally, I think that I'm going to let it be that way. However, if we wanted to, we could continue to expand the floor plan out a little bit. Create this double layer of arches. And we could use this area as a planter. We could also expand the walls of our building back to give it a larger floor space. So there are multiple ways that we can handle this. I think that for the purposes of creativity, I'm going to leave it like this. And I'm going to add a floor to the top. Because I want this area to be a planter, I'm going to use the dry stone, and I'm going to layer the floor as such. And the reason I want to do this is because if guests look upward, and by guests I mean possibly human guests who are going to come visit your park if you want to put this on the internet, possibly just you when you're going to look around your zoo, you may appreciate not having just a wall of dirt on the bottom here. Keeping a barrier of stone between your dirt adds a little bit of a realistic flair without compromising any of the aesthetics. Next thing that we need to do is we need to add a roof. I'm going to add another piece of stone right here, so that way when I add my planter to this little corner it looks good. Next, let's go ahead and get out our plaster. And I think that I want a steep roof on this. Let's go ahead and do our color matching. And now let's go ahead and pick a roof style. For this particular building, I'm going more with a European cottage style. So I'm going to pick a roof that matches with that aesthetic. Personally, I think that the Twilight shingles will probably be our best bet. If you do not have the Twilight DLC, you can replace this with anything else. So long as you're using roof pieces, it really doesn't matter. Next, I think that I want an awning on this side. So how are we going to achieve that? Well, the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to get one of my 1 meter shingle roofs. And I'm going to bring it down just like that. But I think that it would look weird if I did the same thing on this opposite side. So instead I'm going to get eaves. In this case, I'm going to use the 2 meter. And I'm going to use eaves on this side as well to extend it out. So now we have all of the basic shapes done that we can use on the grid. At this point, we should probably move into using non-gridded props. We're going to use the same techniques that we used previously on these other buildings. So we are going to use wooden beams to frame these out. We are going to highlight any doors. And for this one, I'm going to add railings to all of the areas that are going to be gardens. And then after that, I will add mulch. So that'll be part of the speed build, and when we come back, we'll talk about what we're going to do next. So we're now back from framing out this house, and we can already see that a style is coming together. Just by adding the little corners to the edges, we've already started to capture that European-style cottage look. However, we are now running into the point where we need to consider detail, and we need to consider how to do fences. Initially, my plan was to use one of the existing fences that we get in the base game, but unfortunately we didn't have any that I particularly liked. So instead of using one of the fences that we have and compromising our style, I'm going to show you how to build a fence in this game. Thankfully, it's fairly easy. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to get the right size wood. This is one of the reasons why when Planet Zoo comes out with a new kind of wood, I never begrudge it because I constantly need more. In this case, I think that the one that I want is going to be the conservation set. The reason that I want this is because it offers us standard 2x4s, 1x4s, and standard building materials that you would see in real life. These make it a lot easier to build fences out of. The Twilight fence also has wood that's usually pretty good for this sort of building. However, I'd rather stick with this sort of conservation style because it's going to give us a simpler, cleaner look. It also is flexicolor, which is quite handy, although I think the Twilight stuff is as well. So the first thing that we need are fence posts, and we need cross beams. In this case, I'm going to use the cladding beam thick 2 meter. In this case, I think I'm going to use the 1 meter. 1 meter will usually bring a fence up to the waist height of your guests. 2 meters stands at about the total height of your guests. From here, I need something thinner, and I need it to be fairly short. So I'm going to go with this cladding beam thin 1. If I rotate it out, we see that we can get something that looks a little bit like this. Now the question is whether or not that's too thick. So there are other pieces that we can use. For example, we can use these conservation slats, rotate them, and use them as beams instead. They're about as thick as our post, which is what we're looking for. So at this point, we've made your standard farm fence. If we wanted to add a little bit more flair, we could duplicate an advanced move, and we can rotate on the point that it's already at until the two match up. Change our tool to world axis. Shift the piece down until all of the points match up. And it looks absolutely classic. I think that I want this color to be different for the piece that we're doing, so we're going to select all four. But we see that when we do that, we can't actually edit their color channels. So we're going to select the three that are the same, find a wood color that we do like. I think that that's probably good. And now we can click back to the other one and do the same. Some pieces will share the same flexi color channels, and therefore can be edited together as one unit. Other times you need to remove pieces until you find a collection that actually work together. This is important when you're working with the North Africa versus base game plaster pieces, because those don't necessarily agree with each other at all times. This is all of the fence that we need, because at this point we can select the entire item, duplicate an advanced move, and because all of our items are existing on the same XYZ plane, and all we've done is rotate where they are in their position, when we move these items, they're going to move within a straight line. And this will be true whether we have it on world axis or relative, which means that even if we were off of the world axis grid, these would still manage to form a cohesive pattern together. Let's go ahead and move our fence upward and move it into place. Alrighty, and so our fencing is done. This gives us a nice overview of what we're going to be doing next. We're going to be adding in the mulch and the gardening areas to this. Because this looks like a nice little patio, we can fill this in with mulch. Alternatively, we can use baskets in order to create sort of a flower garden look that I've seen on several Austrian houses that I think looks very nice. And instead add a door right here as though this were an actual house. However, for the one in the back, I do think that I want to keep it a traditional garden. So let's go ahead and get out our mulch, and let's start working with how we can add a little bit of nature to our building. Because of the fact that we are working with a garden top roof, and because of the fact that we are using plants up here, and there's always going to be a risk of how much the moisture is going to affect the building, I think one of the things that we need to consider is going to be the root depth. So for example, we don't really have a lot of space up here to plant a tree, and even if we did, we don't want the roots to spread into the building and potentially compromise it. So instead, let's use small plants with very shallow root areas. For example, cordylines. And I think dwarf coronels will add a nice little pop of color as well. There we go, a nice simple garden roof. Now let's talk about hanging baskets. There are several ways that you can potentially do this with the base game, but you're gonna have to use pieces that you wouldn't ordinarily think of. However, I believe in the tropical pack, we should have received baskets as well. We have the East Asia basket. Let's remove a line of surface. So we have two different East Asia baskets. It appears that I'm mistaken. However, I think that these East Asia baskets will probably do the job quite nicely. So let's go ahead and grab the smaller of those. Here we go. We have our East Asia basket. And let's go ahead and hook these to our posts. I like a little bit of symmetry, so that's what we're going to do here. And now let's go ahead and get out a small flower that can plausibly fit in these. I think that I like these Alpine Phacelia. I think I'm going to call them Phacelia. Although I did find that the monkey-faced orchards also look good in here as well. So I'm going to use a mixture of these. There we go. Now we have these nice little planters. I think it's coming along. So now let's talk about how we add the European cottage style into our building. First thing that we need to do is we need to deal with this line right here. So I'm going to use my timbers and I'm going to frame out this bottom edge. Ideally by not using random rotation. That would be unfortunate. There we go. So now we need to add depth to this, as well as giving it those cross wooden beams that we normally see on these sorts of structures. So this particular kind of cottage is something called a wattle and door. The way that these were originally made was that a wattle, or a sort of weaving net, or a sort of weaving, would be made out of usually thatch and sticks. These would be framed within large pieces of wood, such as these logs, as sort of a mesh, at which point that would be covered over with a mixture of clay and other materials. That would form the dorb. After that, the entire thing would be whitewashed with lime. That's where the term whitewashing originally came from. When you originally put the mud on these buildings, it was brown, obviously, and then a mixture of, it was either lye or lime, and a couple of other materials would be mixed and then painted on top in order to give it this plain white look. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and add the log structures that we know are holding this building together. I am going to inset these slightly so that way we get the illusion of depth. This first one I'm going to do only a little bit inset. And now I'm going to immediately copy this to the other side. This is because as we copy things over, and they're gaining these different layers of depth, they're not going to translate over to this opposite well exactly correct. There we go. And now I know that we're going to need some cross beams. So let's go ahead and take our anchor point, and much like we did with the fences, let's go ahead and just turn it at different directions. We'll use our universal world access tool in order to make sure that they connect at the bottom and the top. Sometimes the easiest way to do this is to simply take the piece that you've already copied over and get a smaller version and drag it down. I think that looks good. Now I could copy this entire piece that I've done on this side, and I could take it over to the opposite side if I wanted them to be identical. But for these sorts of buildings, I find that they're rarely identical on both sides if you want to capture the sort of whimsy of the aesthetic. There we go. Now let's add another little crossbeam over here, making sure to use the thin side. And doing the same over here. Next, I think that I want my door to be somewhere right around here. And because we're not going to use an actual door piece, all that we need to do is make sure that our timber is framing the proper area. I think that's done. So let's go ahead and add in our door. In this case, I think I'm probably going to end up using this Arctic door. It fits perfectly into the area that we made, although admittedly that was coincidence. We could stop here, but I think at this point it's nice to consider windows. These houses would have been built for keeping hot air in order to keep this and to keep the snow out. So we want to make sure that during the summer months they have some kind of way to vent the air, or else it's going to get too stuffy. This is a complaint that I do have with the Arctic pack. These windows are absolutely adorable. They're more like decorative windows. This one isn't even a window, it's just a little, like, creche sort of thing, which can be very useful if you want to build a creche. I don't want to for this building. I see that this European window has the ability to change the exterior color, so I think I might want to use something like this. Right about here would be good. However, considering that we have all of these awkward cut shapes, it might be more interesting for us to build our own windows, and to add them wherever we like. This is one of the cases where I do find that the Twilight pack comes in handy. So let's look at how we can build our own windows. First things first, we're going to need these Twilight window panes. There are other materials that you can make out of this. For example, there is just standard glass that comes with a base game. And I believe that there are some other stained glass pieces that come with the Africa pack if you do have that. However, I'm not sure how applicable they are here. For my case, I'm going to use the Twilight, but like I said, you could replace these with the standard glass. This is the 2 meter by 1 meter panel. I'm gonna go ahead and click buy, and I'm doing this away from my wall, and you'll see why in a minute. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find some window shutters. I have the European window shutters. There are multiple kinds that I can use. I think that I'm going to use these. Let's do just the one shutter for this. For our purposes, I'm going to twist it at a jaunty angle, as if it's supposed to be open. And I don't think that this red is going to fit in very well, so let's go ahead and change that red to something that fits a little bit better. Let's go ahead and frame it with our brown, and let's continue to add a pop of color. Considering that we have so much red and purple already, I think let's go ahead and go with a slightly lighter red, like maybe this pink, and let's go with a contrasting color, like a blue, maybe something like that. Because this shutter would fit directly over this window, we don't need to add a secondary shutter. We can if we want to. For example, we could go ahead and select buy for this object right here, select these two, duplicate, go to our world axis because we're building on the world axis, duplicate through here, and use this one as a spacer. This gives us just enough room to put a small wooden spar. Alternatively, if you want to be a little bit cheaty, because of the fact that we already have these painted to wood, we can go ahead and use the one that was right here, merge it inward, and use that as our wooden spar right there. Because this is going to be set into a section of the building that nobody is going to be able to see into, we can use a cheaty method like this. However, if you'd rather not do that, you can just go get a regular piece of wood. I'm going to use this Indonesian piece because it has these weathering marks on it that I think will look good with the rest of our building. Let's go ahead and frame out the bottom and the top. If you're feeling dedicated to detail, there are hinges that you could add at this point. However, I find that these don't necessarily contribute anything because they're so small that you're not going to actually see. If that's a piece of detail that you would like to use, then feel free to use it. Now, the reason why we wanted to use these twilight windows, or alternatively our glass windows, is because there are something called emissive panels, E-M-I-S-S, and they should be under all, unless of course, I've got a filter on that doesn't need to be there. Emissive window panel 2 meter by 1 meter. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate my twilight window pane, and I'm going to click on this emissive panel. We see that it's clipping in, and we see that it's automatically dark. We want this. Let's go ahead and pull it out just a little bit, although you will notice that on this side it seems that I've done nothing. For whatever reason, it is invisible on one side, but not the other. The side that is not invisible is the one that you want facing out towards the world. I'm going to hit check, drag it over, hit check again, and while you can no longer see through the windows, when we turn this to night, for the purposes of Sandbox, I'm going to go ahead and turn on Power Everything under my economy settings, and we see that the windows now glow. This is a nice touch, especially if you know that you're going to be using your zoo at night. I'm going to select all of these objects, making sure to get everything. If you know that this is going to be an aesthetic that you want to continue throughout your park, you can now split selection from group, and you can now duplicate it and move it wherever you would like it to go. For example, I think that I want a window right here. This spar is in the way, so I'm going to go ahead and move it. Now I can move this out of the way, and it can be part of my build kit for the park. There we go. I think that's probably enough. Let's go ahead and turn the lights back on. And now we remember that this whole section through here is also going to be walkable. Now there are two different ways that you can decide to add some kind of railing to this. The first one is to go into your paths, select align to grid, turn on railing on elevated, which I previously had off, and you can create a railing using that very quickly. However, if the path that you are using doesn't have a railing that you like, you can always remove that, and we can instead use our custom railings that we previously built. This is another case where if you have the same issues that I had previously, where you want to be able to adjust your fencing regardless of whatever's happening with the building, and you don't want to have to select about 200 pieces in order to do it, you can duplicate an advanced move, pull it away from your item, split selection from group, move the item back in, alternatively add it to your build kit, and now you can either select the object completely, the entire group, and duplicate and move as you please, or you can go into the object itself and move it as such. My widget decided that it wanted to readjust itself somewhere along the line, so I'm having to use the world axis again. This is one of the reasons why I recommend building your entire unit on the world axis, so that way you have free access to this tool. Otherwise, it gets a little bit complicated. Now let's say that I wanted to duplicate and move this entire section to speed up the process. I no longer have to worry about selecting the building as well. Makes building a lot faster. When a group no longer knows how to calculate, or it has too many averages to use, it will often return back to using the world axis. So that's another thing to keep in mind as well. Sometimes it will just do it because of its own whimsy. I've not quite figured out the pattern. However, I know that there is one, so keep your eye out for it. There we go. We've now met our safety regulations, and we have the basis for our little multi-layer building. This method with the pathing can also be done with anything that you can reasonably stack. I like to use it for my staff's facilities so that way I can keep my negative area of impact to the smallest foot space possible. From here we can continue to decorate out. But again, the primary goal of this is to show you how to build a multi-layer building, along with some tips and tricks that can make adding detail to your builds just a little bit easier. Because of the time constraints, it's usually not feasible for me to go on to fully detail these buildings and explain how I do it all in one go. So instead, that will be a tutorial of its own using a building that we've already made during this series. I hope that this has been useful to you. If you have any kind of building tutorials that you would like to request in the future, please leave me a comment down below, and I will hopefully try and incorporate them. Good luck building, and I hope to see you next time.